Kirby Superstar takes full advantage of the limitations that were becoming apparent in its formula. It was the first game meant to translate it away from its only frame of reference, its NES and Game Boy titles. While the SNES could offer more robust gameplay at this point, the Kirby series was now essentially defined by this compacted nature. It proves this in its first chapter, which is gone through in less than a few minutes, directly paralleling the original title on the Game Boy, which is done purposefully as a means of moving players to the ways this concept has been rigorously reworked. You might even say it's a little more refined than the original Game Boy title. It serves as a good starting point to what Superstar sets out to do, by heightening the supposed design philosophy of the Kirby series, pressing into this until fully committing to it. If the gameplay feels kind of simple, if the design is limited, why not hone that in, exploring this interaction through limitation, since, after setting this scene with Spring Breeze, things open up considerably. This continues to be the case through each subsequent segment of the game, which serve as their own independent, bite-sized adventures. The benefits become obvious. We're given a few options on what to start with, providing a non-linearity that this variety pack format could only provide, other than maybe accounting for player comfort, which is done in the form of a difficulty rating, and of course, only making certain selections available until other sections are beaten. So there is technically a sense of structure here, just with way more breathing room than what was usually allowed. So, what's stopping them from trying anything they prefer inside this deliberate freedom? I guess the only issue in this is that it inherently gives players this opportunity to prefer doing some things over others, and that might affect how each section is considered. Basically, every concept introduced into a game inadvertently interacts with one another, creating this contrast that can be exciting in the ways it offers kinds of engagement that weren't present previously. But if this gap between them feels too distant, it can also imply that there will be things players would rather be doing instead. What if players really connect with some sections, but not the others? Will they simply miss doing one thing while they're doing another? It's a valid issue I've faced in a number of titles, but mainly in ones that choose to contrast these gameplay styles with one another, offering these different experiences that simply create this chance of playing sides to what they might gravitate towards. And there's this risk of being unable to accommodate this that could simply leave every element involved feeling less defined than it might deserve. Superstar usually skirts this quite well in what it chooses to focus on, keeping its gameplay rather consistent and segmenting things narratively first, only changing the central mechanics when absolutely necessary. Kirby Superstar Ultra, its remake, which could be classified closer as a sequel, is miraculous in comparison with how it takes advantage of certain aspects in the original that were present but less understood, mainly through this formula, which almost starts to make more sense in this new context through its reformatting on the Nintendo DS. The sample platter formula translates perfectly well within the handheld medium, maybe even a little too well, since the pick up and play whenever mentality was not something consoles were structured around. In that way, Superstar almost feels ahead of its time. It won't become all that relevant until later on, but expect a lot of footage from it, because I really prefer its aesthetic over the original. It has a much more satisfying use of CGI for its backgrounds, sometimes becoming very abstract to the point of artistry, something that would become consistent throughout the series after this point. And it has much more confidence in this aesthetic, I guess, adding these little flourishes, which could only exist by refining the previous version. Maybe it's a sign of how the hindsight of the original really helps to strengthen this version in particular. Well, during this playthrough, I put some extra attention into the variety of incentives between each of the game's chapters, which is what mainly kept each section distinct. As a platformer seeking to fully flesh out its potential, one of the greatest obstacles is to provide players with a reason to engage with the material beyond its simple traversal, to assure they are willing to invest their own time when engaging with it, rather than just gunning to the exit. So each aspect of Superstar provides this in its own unique way, to both assume a sense of variety and allow for a stronger investment. Dynablade is essentially a unique derivative of the previous chapter, making it a very good starting point, while also letting Superstar show off its own new strong suits. It is a series of similarly brief levels that constantly feels memorable, being refined down to these stage elements and platforming sections exclusively, with each level being a series of these, with no fat whatsoever. There is a map as well, allowing players to go back and play any level they'd like, even if there's very little left to do once it's gone through. It does create a bit of wiggle room with secret levels you can find off the beaten path. Or, well, with how focused the design is, it's more about knowing when to do certain things, or where to look. Here you can pick any ability in the whole game. That's convenient. Though with a total of 5 levels, and no incentive to play these past their progression, all it ends up being is a good effort. There's also a little mini-game after each stage. Get the right timing, and you'll be given a few extra lives. Again, it's a structure that would have made sense at a much more substantial size, so seeing it here feels more like a novelty by the end of it. It's strange to see this in a game where its mechanics are used so frivolously to achieve a much wider variety pack feeling, but it seems to make more sense past this contemporary use, as it more or less shapes the structure of Kirby games going forward. And this formatting only lightly implies this true potential, only existing here as a brief but charming gimmick, up until it culminates in the Dynablade fight, where a wacky misunderstanding happens after Kirby realizes he's bludgeoned a mother of 3. Then, yeah, that's it. But I will say that Dynablade, who of course defines this entire miniature adventure, serves an important role in continuing to showcase the game as its own thing. She bookends both points of the story to frame the gameplay entirely, creating this unexpected bit of narrative that manages to squeeze even more out of Superstar's style of reduction. Much like all the other rarely used flourishes, we end up with a unique experience all the way through. Despite the brisk pace, it pulls no punches in what it's willing to attempt. Dynablade helps to define the new territory Kirby finds itself in, and she'll continue to show up from this point to help cement this. This integration feels seamless, all because of the grand scale it's able to achieve in such small doses, which leaves its little story feeling all the more memorable. Gourmet Race, at only about 3 levels, is done with quickly. Though, I would like to applaud the structure of these stages for a moment, perfectly blending this gamey function with its form, and creating immensely memorable set pieces through the simple act of structuring these spaces, all while elaborating on its challenge, instead of directly increasing its difficulty. The further along you go, the more choices you're given in how to get through each race, even incorporating power-ups at a point, all to leave these choices in how complicated the path forward is directly in a player's hands, which is a pretty unexpected level of complexity for something that will be played through and done with so quickly. It might leave a lot to be desired, but its restraint creates this mechanically rich experience that stands well alongside the rest of the game, but never overpowers it. Even after who knows how many times, I do still get a little anxious that I'll somehow lose. I never do though. And if anything, that might be a testament to its tight, effective design. The Revenge of Meta Knight is yet another simple romp across a few levels, a now expected format, which the game seems to acknowledge as well. It remains interesting in the lens it is set through, presenting a consistent theming within Meta Knight's airship, and squeezing out every ounce of potential that concept offers in the process. Kirby fights his way atop the ship. He clings to its side. He crawls around the vents. He busts through its vitals, all while causing utter chaos in his wake. It still conforms to this level-based structure, but stringing it together in a constant, hectic movement, with fast-paced platforming and intense transitioning that feels far more fluid, resulting in this brief burst of gameplay, teeming with a deeper sense of player engagement. as we also get this back and forth with Meta Knight and his henchmen, and this helps to frame a narrative through the action as it goes along, as they all come to terms with their own hubris, after believing they could even think to take down Kirby. All while Kirby is really just doing what he's always been doing. They interact with him from the sidelines, the added flourishes, and strong theming, helping to sell this different perspective when we're essentially engaging with the same structure of material. You're also on the outside, looking in. Even though you are Kirby, Kirby is also being addressed directly now, which I think really shakes up the formula in a small but significant way, all of which helps to create a unified experience that props up the purposeful limitations in its level design. It successfully creates an intended tone through its attention to detail, developing this personality despite these apparent restrictions. You're left with this captivating story of Kirby's perseverance, his struggle to triumph every step of the way, despite the odds stacked against him, and his absolute dominion over Meta Knight's indomitable fleet, all culminating in a final one-on-one battle, an intense escape sequence, and then the simple yet poignant ballad, letting us stir in Kirby's victory and in Meta Knight's downfall. It's almost melancholy in that way. The Great Cave Offensive is a vast collection of puzzles, restructuring the previous segments around an added, albeit pointless, incentive, which isn't saying much, without nothing ever leaves the extents of the segments anyways. The point A to point B is always going to be the real motivation, no matter how much complexity that's given. Though, it's surprising how naturally obligated you feel to grab everything as you go along, to get that full collection and that final cap on the reward screen, almost as if the incentive itself becomes the satisfaction in collecting everything. And that does drive you across the entire hefty segment, which I guess is obvious, since the entire mode is designed around finding these treasure chests, occasionally uncovering them, sometimes fighting to get at them in time. In this, areas are allowed to open up in a way they were never meant to previously. Sure, there is technically a direct path to get from one section to another, but this is one the game leaves you to guess, to motivate personal exploration. There are plenty of points where the way forward is purposefully forked into alternate paths, all with their own string of challenges and treasures. But I guess this also introduces the possibility of letting players get a little lost. You'll want to progress and find a winding dead end, or you'll be looking for all the treasures and realize you've hit the boss. Getting around is, of course, not all that strenuous, other than the ways the game itself kind of conditions you inside its own limits. These brief distances of backtracking start to feel unbearable. In a game with very little empty space, having this downtime can kind of break the experience. The mode does also incorporate these save points, so I'm sure Hal understood how intimidating it was in comparison, especially when it's placed alongside everything else. It even contrasts this small-scale approach the game has been designed around. The Great Cave Offensive is a massive fish in a pool of small experiences, and it is done with just as briskly as it starts, simply leaving the satisfaction in engaging with its design, ending about the same way it started, which comes to feel symbolic of this. Despite its issues, it's also an entirely self-imposed experience, one that naturally draws in much more engagement, and that's what's truly impressive about it, which I find is a better thought to leave it on. Milky Way Wishes has the smartest addition of player incentives by removing what makes Kirby, Kirby. Each copy ability is retooled into a collectible, one that cannot be used until it's found in a predetermined spot, and then it becomes a resource that can be used whenever, even if this eventually boils down into finding the one you like and getting to use it no matter how many times you lose it. It's still the greatest reward system, since it's something we've relied on for the entire game. A realization that is fitting for the accumulative finale of the game. In this, each stage is structured similarly to something like Dynablade or the Great Cave Offensive, leading players to engage with every inch of its careful, conscious design, to assure they aren't missing a valuable addition to their arsenal. Each of the 7 segments here are pretty much retooled completely from the other segments of the game, but are recontextualized in a way that helps avoid a certain feeling of repetition. They're all basically constructed out of pre-existing resources, which were meant for certain contexts, that are placed in ways which can feel haphazard, given our past experiences with them. But by creating new experiences with these in its design, and consistently offering strong scenarios that shape each brief stage, it never feels stale. I've always wondered whether certain assets were made with one section in mind, or the other way around. Or maybe every piece was always meant to be used more fluidly, to avoid straining the development process of all these separate sections. There's an ambiguity there that just goes to show how well this reuse is incorporated. So this condensed nature continues to be a plus up until the end, perfectly reconfiguring everything we've dealt with before now into these themed planets that come to feel just as impactful in their minimalist dedication to design. Palette use, in particular, does a lot of heavy lifting here, surprisingly. Familiar backgrounds are given these overworldly variations, and most enemies have 1 or 2 alternate color schemes as well, which all helps to really sell this feeling of planet hopping, instead of implying this act of going through the motions again. Additionally, Ultra creates alternate colors for bosses, which I feel slightly forgives their more blatant reuse, as it caps off each stage. Maybe my brain just works in an odd way, where I like to see alternate color schemes on pre-established designs like that. Either way, repackaging almost every other chapter into these original stages makes good use of every element, in a way that never feels too obtrusive, continuing to offer intriguing level design that only elaborates further on previous ones. Despite its fragmentation, Milky Way Wishes ends with a bang, fitting for the larger journey we have gone through, cramming in a wholly original side-scrolling segment, which leads into the final boss. And just like the rest of the game, these are done with in a shocking haste, only barely realizing these scenarios. Yet, that in itself leaves a sort of impression that'll never go away. It punctuates this experience as this game brimming with potential, instead of simply feeling exhausted, all concluding in a single, celebratory climax that goes to show how, in limitation, experts can still find room for spectacle. There's just so much leverage they get out of this structure, in how easily they can recontextualize its elements, as the rules behind them change. It's a testament to limitation, and how, despite the simplicity of its design, it can create a captivating experience, wholly influenced by its consciousness to this interaction. Although, I feel like the only downside to this structure is its familiarity with how condensed each section is. If you don't gel with it, it can feel like a slog to get through, and I think a majority of that has to do with what it sets up for you. Dealing with a much longer section, like the Great Cave Offensive, can wear you down, since, without realizing it, you're much more susceptible to the format the game is expected of you. Then again, that might be because this was like my 10th playthrough of the game. I think I have a good reason for finding that it drags on a bit, so feel free to ignore my one criticism. And much like the beginning of the game, Ultra pulls a similar trick in offering more content which branches off from where Superstar once ended. Personally, I think The Revenge of the King is great, in its further elaboration on Superstar's elements. It looks at it all from a distance, to the point of amalgamating most of its components together, even if its inclusion can't help but feel a little odd, as it is a clear extension from the pre-established canon of Kirby Superstar. In its creation, which is about a decade late, it is wholly derivative, as a mode exclusive to Ultra. I mean, even the scenario is lifted straight from Meta Knight's Revenge. It stands out as a conscious decision, isolated from the original, but it uses this to its advantage. It directly builds off of Spring Breeze, ramping up the difficulty within its level design, as it stays closely reminiscent of this. This gives Ultra the time it deserves to work independently from the original, and that results in some visuals that manage to be even more stunning than the updated backgrounds. Ultra reinterprets Superstar's original aesthetic, creating a unique vision that's teeming with striking imagery. And these liberties are much more apparent in Dedede's Revenge, where its unrestrained vision can now shine through. I could go on and on about how effective this new design philosophy is in strengthening a past vision through modern capabilities, but I'll just say how well these hold up in comparison to the original, in its understanding of CGI at a much earlier stage. But at the same time, it's kind of ironic how Superstar's cutscenes hold up much better when compared to the dated CGI of Ultra's cinematics. It all kind of gives you this weird look at a timeline that now feels much faster than it really was, with almost two different levels of presentation that now feel awkward from this contemporary perspective. Looking back 10 years ago on a game based on something another 10 years ago. I'm sure this is all a matter of taste though, but for example, I kept feeling more compelled to use the old cutscenes over the new ones. Both have their own charm to them though. Tangent aside, it remains true that through this brief window, Ultra can be wholly unique from what it was expected to parallel up until this point, and that does lead to some interesting results. The palettes are made to be much more intense, in a very memorable way. All the enemies have even been given redesigns that basically parallel the original game's expert mode, all while letting this reuse feel more progressive in these slight tweaks. Always letting each section stand out in some way. Although the rips of bosses from other games do stand out quite a bit in just how frivolously they're able to use them, it leans a bit too much into feeling economic with the recycling, but relegating it to this mode at least gives it some more identity. Even the brief reuse of unique gameplay elements, the shoot 'em up with Kabuto, and the reintroduction of text with Dedede frantically trying to ward off Kirby is particularly fun to see. Since this back and forth of Kirby's gameplay and Dedede's responses are really just another excuse to make these motions feel more satisfying, breaking up an obvious tedium in the boss rush format of its final stage, though they do manage to squeeze in some recolors on this already packed cast of oddly returning bosses. So, bonus points for me, obviously. This interaction is just a bit too similar to the dynamic I mentioned previously in The Revenge of Meta Knight, just with much less impact given the situation, as Dedede quickly starts to scramble under the pressure, and he already seems about ready to give in. That facade is wiped away pretty quickly, which is only a problem by the final fight, when it gets back around to feeling very intense. It's almost like including this banter just removes that mystique this return was clearly meant to imply. The masked Dedede fight is the obvious highlight of the entire experience, presenting this unique scenario, which is so bold in its depiction, as an idea completely isolated from the original, that it quickly becomes just as memorable as its predecessor, building off of its structure, but injecting unique concepts that stand well on their own. A fascinating feat for what was only considered a pre-established remake. Revenge of the King is a truly transformative sum of its parts, where, despite its clear contrast to the original, ends up feeling like a seamless extension of it. The arena accumulates the vast array of bosses that have been encountered throughout each of the game's segments, while removing the supposed context meant for each, creating a unique environment in itself, a challenge of stamina and skill to overcome each boss in one sitting. The arena was included in the original SNES version, and caps off right at the Marks fight, serving its purpose as a collection of previous encounters. But Ultra has two other variants to accommodate its new elements and expectations. Helper to Hero, a mode incorporating the player 2 characters who are usually as useful as much as I've bothered to mention them. I will say their implementation is pretty satisfying. That cycle of bringing them to life, watching them struggle to keep up as their life is whittled down, until they're gone in a flashy burst of energy, sometimes pulling through once they touch an enemy and take their form. It's a neat little element to tack on top that's fun to follow in passing as you go along. And Ultra does some more interesting things with this, allowing players to wirelessly connect their consoles and play together like that, as well as Helper to Hero, which is a compelling enough alternate version of the arena that crams in a lot of replayability, relegating players to a single partner character, essentially a single ability in Kirby's arsenal. And I love how each is made to be its own character as well, going just a bit above a simple reincorporation of the partner mechanic to do so. Another benefit to Ultra's hindsight of the original, which allows it these extra resources to fit even more content. Then there's the definitive, true arena, which scoops the handful of additional bosses exclusive to the remake, and creates an even greater, cumulative challenge. I feel as if there's a lot more to say on this that spans the game as a whole, maybe even the series itself. Ultra is kind of baffling in that way, through what it has achieved, unlike many other remakes, in its apparent influence over the structure of the series going forward, even if, almost literally, its additions can feel tacked on. Fights that were introduced here become staples. The theme and overall aesthetic of Masked DDD has been carried over up to this day, basically becoming an impromptu motif for the character. This is also the case for Superstar's other additional chapter, Meta Nightmare, which provides an essential groundwork in how content can be reutilized more meaningfully, even if that's done much less efficiently at first, since it is a mode built around heavily condensing the entire game and blasting through it at a breakneck pace. And Meta Knight's moveset complements this, and that's fairly effective, given that most players are probably exhausted of everything the game has thrown at them, and just want to get through this retread. That's how I feel, at least. Though, it is kind of interesting to see them pull apart the game and make it work around him. Especially when it doesn't. Continuing to frame how post-game content reshapes previously experienced areas, as well as introducing Galactonite, and the whole mindset behind that, which is absolutely defined of the series in these incentives through greater challenges. Despite Meta Nightmare's inherent presence as supplementary content, there was already a sense of what this could offer. There's a potential behind the expectations this mode creates. What we're supposed to get out of this by the end influences the entire experience of the game. The act of squeezing in additional content, like bosses or story, through this structure, makes these into rewards in the eyes of dedicated players. And this format clearly gives this more impact, recontextualizing everything through a player's own investment to engage with this further. It effectively lets this reuse feel refreshing, efficiently giving the space for more ambitious ideas to exist within the game's universe. And things become more complex as time goes on to continue achieving this, where a need to engage with this sense of challenge collides with a fascination in the narrative directions this has allowed the series to take, eventually resulting in fully transformative versions of pre-existing content, which is purely meant to perpetuate this new demand, all of which neatly ties into the final subject I'd like to discuss: the prevalence of these bosses, and the specific kind of investment this has allowed, and heavily facilitated, since, by satisfying an expectation that begins with this game, has constantly escalated, creating this perpetual cycle of spectacle that Ultra definitely instigates. Another aspect of this lies in the true arena itself, which has come to utterly shape the direction Kirby games would take throughout the years. It rewards a level of dedication and skill with further challenge. The iconic presence of Mark's soul is one that only exists through this more advanced, conscious incentive that has now thoroughly shaped the course of the series. This derivative use of content in the creation of scenarios with added difficulty has since then placed further value on what are essentially extra fights. Obviously, at first, in their definitive nature, since defeating Mark's soul wraps up the game yet again, and for the final time, successfully giving off a sense of importance through its challenge that provides a finale purely meant to justify a player's own perseverance to achieve this. But it's also in the obvious intensity this allows, by readdressing and adding on to this previous conflict, producing the space where amplifying challenge becomes a priority. And Mark's soul has clearly left a mark, of course, in the constant replication of its intimidating presence, but also in the ways this has heavily influenced the perception of later games, down to the structuring of its content. For a series that is meant to feel approachable, its pivot into this since Ultra shouldn't fit. I mean, I might even say, the arena has outgrown its presence as a simple repackaging of content in the eyes of its fans. To the point of being designed around these specific incentives, you can sort of map out this crossover of when this formula stops feeling purely functional, as this method of offering difficulty for those looking for it, as it transitions into a full-blown facet of the game, tying its narrative around the significance of these fights and their spectacle. These are now meant to satisfy a deeply ingrained demand between fans and developers alike, as each kind of rewards each other through its history and a growing discussion within this gameplay in its progression. HAL has to outdo itself, and its shockingly hardcore audience follows suit by conquering this. And they get more fascinating tidbits of Kirby's ever-expanding world in this. So in the 14 years since Ultra set this stage, the games now seem to exclusively cater towards a vastly different audience. One it has personally cultivated due to this. But yeah, take a step back from that for a sec, and I think you'll agree. That feels kind of unbelievable to admit. Recent games like Star Allies or Forgotten Land have several tiers of bosses and arenas. Their post-game content can start to feel much more blatant in its creation of challenges, fully committing to these expectations, which now feel necessary in this self-imposed obligation, to the point where several of these can exist in one game. But their palettes are getting much more ambitious in contrast, so no complaints for me. I think it's a shared sentiment that players might cast the actual gameplay aside to experience these fights, as they have only ramped up in scope, presentation, and complexity over time, becoming something it relies on for its personality, which inevitably leads me into a strange take that has inspired me to make this discussion. I find it baffling that the Kirby series has transformed into something so combat heavy. If you were to look at it now, it would be hard to deny it might be classified closer as an action platformer, despite everything I've mentioned about the simple satisfaction in its structure, which, undeniably, still exists alongside this. And this relationship is something Ultra officially instigated. Its formula makes it possible to have it both ways. And that's amazing, isn't it? Even if I still personally feel like there's some more room for the series to explore this change of identity. The more it commits to being so combat heavy, the more it should change to feel defined by it. Of course, the copy abilities have always naturally lended themselves to this, offering new movesets that, other than the occasional puzzle, can only be put to use in combat. But I just never felt the games had satisfying enough combat to justify this priority. In many of the games, Kirby will just rub up against his enemies as he attacks them. Many of his moves bring him in that direction. And when dealing with static bosses, that can leave you stuck inside of them. It took up until Forgotten Land, where it started to mesh with me more, when contact damage was removed entirely. And other things, like the dodge mechanic, or the further emphasis on each ability as a kind of combat moveset, certainly come to complement this. But yeah, Just look at what point the series has reached since then. These fights have undoubtedly become highlights of the games, and Hal knows this, structuring themselves around them in ways that continue to feel heavily influenced from Superstar Ultra's introduction of this. It's a functional, long-standing system that clearly serves its purpose. Well, either way, Superstar Ultra manages to be a prolific title within the Kirby series, marking a change in direction that it has clearly benefited from. Much like what the original set out to achieve, it addresses the placement of the series as a whole, clearly becoming an essential role in discovering what will compel Hal to keep it fresh and constantly captivating. Yeah, you know what? I'm just gonna splice this in here quick. Just a little on the music, since I've been adding it in right now, and I feel weird I haven't acknowledged any of it. It's kind of like the CGI versus sprite cutscenes, where Superstar's sound font is much, like, way smoother to listen to. Ultra, I feel like, kind of has this, like, weird film over it. Like, you can hear the low quality in comparison. It's muted, you know? I prefer Superstar over Ultra. And obviously, other than that, the soundtracks kind of speak for themselves. There's no surprise that they're both as memorable as they are, or, you know, as, like, permanent or constant. Also, since I'm slapping this in last minute, let me also throw in some footage of the minigames and say they're pretty good, for what they are. I don't really have anything deep to say about them, other than, you know, they're pretty one-note, but they give that one note a lot of personality, just in, like, the dressing around it. I mean, you punch a hole through the planet after pressing the same button 3 times in slightly different ways. That's kind of impressive. Ultra adds, like, 3 more, and they're way more robust. Specifically, kind of adding multiplayer pretty deliberately. And, yeah, that's everything. Bye.